9mm versus 40 Smith & Wesson. So a lot of people nowadays say that the 9mm is just as good as the 40 Smith & Wesson because of modern bullet technology and all of that. And I'm one of the few people out there that's saying I don't think it is. Just because if you look at historically a lot of the real world information, the data, the statistics, a lot of the accounts that law enforcement has, the 40 Smith & Wesson and the 9mm are not the same. And the 40 Smith & Wesson seems to be a little bit more effective. And when I say that stuff, people are like, well, you just hate on the 9mm. And it's like, I'm just trying to relay the information that I've been reading, and it shows that the 9mm is not quite as good as the 40 Smith & Wesson. I'm not trying to be hateful for anybody's caliber, and I think the 9mm is an okay cartridge. I don't think it would be a bad choice. I think it would stop a threat fine. I think it would work. I'm just saying that overall, I don't see anything where it shows that the 9mm is as good as the 40 Smith & Wesson. So today I have some Doubletap, and these are our controlled expansion rounds. Our 9mm is a plus P, and it's a 124 grain controlled expansion. Our 40 Smith & Wesson, this is the closest bullet weight I could get to that, our 135 grain controlled expansion. Interesting bullets. I'll show a little bit of a close-up right here. Our 9mm over here, interesting looking. Looks kind of like a gold dot, similar to, but it's definitely not, but it has kind of that same look. As where our 40 Smith & Wesson is like a flying ashtray here. Big old hollow cavity for that particular round. So this should be a very interesting test. Our 9mm, 9mm plus P, is a 124 grain and is rated at 1310 feet per second through a 4.5 inch barrel. So that is some pretty powerful stuff in and of its own right. That's pretty powerful. And our 40 Smith & Wesson, this is 10 grains heavier at 135 grain, but that's rated at 1450 feet per second through a 4.5 inch barrel. So that right there alone, that's more powerful than a typical 357 Magnum through a 4-inch barrel. The old duty load that is known for a 96% one-shot stop. This is more powerful than that because we're at the same velocity, but we're at 10 grains heavier. In addition to that, you know, these are rated through 4.5 inch barrels. I'm going to test them through 5-inch barrels. So we have our 5-inch M&P 9 2.0 and our 5-inch 40 M&P 40 2.0. Pretty much identical pistols. So this should be an interesting test. In addition to doing my normal ballistic test that I'm going to do here, which is, you know, I have rib simulation in there, 1/4 inch MDF and all of that. I want to do an arm bone simulation test. So we have 1 1/4 inch birch dowel rod here. This is our arm bone simulation. And I want to do this test because a lot of times something in the way, when somebody's like shooting back at you, there could be something in the way there, like an arm bone, and that might change the trajectory of the rounds. So I just want to see how those will do going through an arm bone too. So let me show you the rest of this ballistic test and we'll get started with the test. All right, so here's our 9mm plus P and our 40 Smith & Wesson through our 5-inch M&P pistols. Our 9mm plus P is a 124 grain, rated at 1310 feet per second. Our 40 Smith & Wesson is a 135 grain, rated at 1450 feet per second. So we're going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy we get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So I'm going to go into our real world simulation, which is going to be 4 layers of sweatshirt material, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum. 16 more inches of clear ballistics and another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. So in this format, this is roughly a half representation of the density of flesh. So 3 inches is more like 1.5 inches actual pectoral muscle, and this is more like 8 inches. So if we got like 16 inches penetration in this, it would be more like 8 inches in a real living target. And then after doing our real world simulation, I'm simply going to put up our arm bone simulation. I'm going to shoot through that into the gel block in the same format and see if there's a big difference between 9mm plus P and 40 Smith & Wesson with our arm bone shot. And then of course I am going to shoot at the steel target because, you know, these are useless if there's too much recoil. I can't hit the target. And we'll see if there's a big difference in our practical accuracy and shootability with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 9mm plus P 124 grain. This is rated at 1310 feet per second out of a 4.5 inch barrel. I'm going to use my 5-inch barrel. See how close I get to 1310 feet per second with our 9mm plus P. 1342, 1328, 1340, 1337, 1361. So a little bit of an increase there from that extra ½ inch of barrel. Now our 40 Smith & Wesson 135 grain. This is rated at 1450. So let's see what I get here with my 5-inch barrel M&P. 40 Smith & Wesson. 1397, 1394, 1376, 1408, 1389. So while that was pretty consistent, it's definitely below the rated velocity. But at the same time, I don't care, because I think at 1450 and above, the recoil would be pretty substantial. As we're with this, it just feels like a normal 40 Smith & Wesson. Recoil feels pretty good, and we're still hitting really high velocity numbers. And this is more similar to the original core bomb 135 grain 40 Smith & Wesson as far as energy goes. So Doubletap did pretty good with this. It's just below the rated velocity. So let's try our Ballistic's gel block and see how these compare. All right, first up, our regular real-world simulation shot. 4 layers of sweatshirt material, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. These are called controlled expansion. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but let's see what these do. 9mm plus P. All right, they hit that pretty hard. I'll set that with our 40 Smith & Wesson. Ooh, let's go take a look. And you hear me make a sound, I think you need to see it from my perspective to understand. Here's the front, here's our 9mm, here's our 40. It busted off in multiple pieces. There's even a piece of jacket on the back of this here. So it fragmented out quite big and left multiple channels going through there. But the actual core continued to go on in through there just fine. Here's our rib simulation, 9mm on the bottom, 40 on top. Not a big difference there in the size that expanded out to when it hit that. Our 9mm went a little bit deeper, and we went to 12 inches with our 9mm. The camera parallax will make it look like it's a little further up than that, but from a straight on view, we're right at 12 inches. Our 40 Smith & Wesson, we went to about, there's one little track there that goes to about 11 3/4, so that technically failed, a lot of people would say, but really it doesn't. I'm going to try to explain that later. Honestly, for what this is, that looks pretty good for what they are. So now I'm really curious though, will that arm bone simulation, what will that do? Will that like fragment these bullets apart and they won't penetrate right? Or I'm not sure what to expect. So let's put on our arm bone simulation and see how these compare. All right, our arm bone simulation. So we just have our 1 1/4 inch birch dowel in front of there, in front of that ballistic gel block set up, and rib simulation, all that's still in there. So I'm really curious about what this is going to do. So let's hit our arm bone simulation into the gel with our 9mm plus P. All right. Let's give this a fresh area to shoot. With our 40. We'll see how this does. 40 Smith & Wesson controlled expansion. Let's see how this does. Let's go take a look. Wow. Everything's been moved around, lifted up here. So let's first take a look at our arm bone simulation. And our first shot here is with our 9mm. It just went through. And this was hit straight too. It's just that when I adjust it, sometimes I don't line it back up in that device. So they went through straight. But our 40, bigger hole obviously, and that hole going out the back looks a lot worse with that 40 than that 9mm to me. And then our first 3-inch piece here, our 9mm kind of failed in a lot of respects. There's just not a lot of energy dump, as where with our 40 there's a ton of energy dump. Our 9mm going through the rib simulation, yeah, we're failing to expand, as where that 40 still has the juice to expand after going through that. Then we look at our 9mm, it went through our back rib simulation. And it stopped at about 20.5 inches. I don't think that would pass through an average size individual, because we need to go about 3 inches past that back rib simulation. So we would stop in an average size individual. So that's a pass on that respect. We did get some tumbling here and whatnot. Now with our 40, it appears we did lose our jacket right here. But our core still expanded and went to 12 inches. So let me explain here what I think about the 40 Smith & Wesson and the 9mm. This type of round was used for a while, and it had an extremely good effect. It had a very good ability to stop a threat. Massad Ayub actually has a story about how he talked to an officer who shot someone, a suspect, in the belly with a 135 grain at about these velocities, and the guy collapsed dead instantly. Bullet didn't hit his spine, didn't do anything like that. It was just the amount of trauma that hit soft tissue. And that's very typical with stuff like this. It has very good stopping effect. But because the FBI came out along with that whole, you need 12 inches minimum penetration because of the FBI shootout, well, they dismissed a lot of really good affecting rounds that had a good effect, because they were not hitting 12-inch minimum. But when you really think about it, the chances of needing that 12-inch minimum are, it's talking about going through the side shot, through an arm bone, through an arm, into the thoracic cavity. And maybe if you don't hit 12 inches in gel, it's not gonna go deep enough in a living target to hit something vital. But the reality of it is, most people are not cops. They're caring for defense. Are they going to take side shots? Probably not. At the end of the day, something like this that doesn't penetrate that far is going to be superior at stopping a threat than to the 9mm. And just because the 9mm sometimes penetrates deeper, people will be like, well, the FBI says. Well, I'm here to say I don't care what the FBI says. I think it's silly to pick a round just because it hits 12 inches when you can pick a round that is going to dump a ton of energy and serve you better. That's my opinion on that. So I'll leave it at that. So I'm going to pull these bullets out of the block and take a close-up look at them. I'm going to shoot our steel target and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through our real-world simulation. Here's our 9mm, and here's our 40 Smith & Wesson. So honestly, there's not a huge difference in the overall size of these from what I can tell out here. Our 9mm did fold back all those pedals pretty well. Just roll all the way back. So that's still a powerful round for what it is. Our 40, I think we broke off more pieces of pedal, so I think our retained weight would actually be less than the 9mm. But both did pretty good for what they are. Now when we go through our arm bone simulation, that's where things change up quite a bit. We lost the jacket with the 40, and we got no expansion with the 9mm. So with the 9mm, that clogged with the wood, and it just went on straight like it was a full metal jacket. The 40, I think because that hollow cavity was so big, it was able to kick out that wood and still expand, and with that extra velocity, there's still plenty of velocity after going through that wood to hit the target and expand out. So big difference there between 9mm and 40. So there sometimes can be a pretty big difference. So that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target, I'm just gonna hit the target as fast as I think I can, accurately hit it, and see if there's a big difference between 9mm plus P and 40 Smith & Wesson, because that is one of the things people say, that 40 Smith & Wesson is so snappy you can't use it for defense. But let's see what I can do here with our 9mm. All right, 40 Smith & Wesson. Yeah, there's a little bit more recoil. My group will open up a little bit more, but I mean, practically speaking, there's not a huge difference that I can tell. So let me back it up from some more distance and see how these things will shoot us at further distance. All right, I came all the way back to 75 yards just for fun, and you know, it's good to know what rounds will do at distance, because what they'll do at 75 yards, they'll do even better at 40 yards or 25 yards. So I think it's good to see what they'll do. So 9mm plus P, 75 yards. Let's see how this stuff shoots for me. I pulled that shot. So not my best work. I think it's just me today, and they seem like they're shooting a little bit high from my point of aim, so just me probably. Let's see what I can do with our 40 here, see if it moves the steel anymore, if I can hit it. All right, I felt more confident with that round. I don't know why. It's almost like the recoil was more straight back, as where the 9mm just felt weird to me. And I think that is just because I've been shooting Magnum handguns the last few days. So when I shoot a 9mm, it's like, it's almost like I don't feel the recoil at all, and then it just feels weird and I pull my shots. But looking at this, interesting results. So when we look at our regular ballistic gel test with the rib simulation on there, both of those did fine. But this is one of those things that happens so often. I get so many debates about. People will be like, well, that 9mm went to 12 inches and that 40 went to 11 3/4. 9mm would work, 40 would fail. And like, this is completely backwards, because that's not how it works. It's very rare you're going to need that 12 inches in gel, which I think would equate to 6 to 8 inches in a real living target, something like that. It's just very rare you're going to need that specific ability. And even if you can't hit something vital, these rounds would pretty much chew up an arm and all that, and it would probably stop a threat, not just by hitting something vital. So looking at it from this, there's just no question with the data that's out there and all of that, the 40 Smith & Wesson is extremely more effective than the 9mm, but because this 12-inch minimum, and yeah, you can hit 12 inches easier with the 9mm because it's a smaller diameter. It's easy to punch that through like that. I mean, I could do that with the 38 Special lead round nose. So looking at just penetration alone, I think, isn't a good way to look at this stuff. The best way to look at it is to go through a lot of the old data that shows what happened, what's the percentages of all this stuff happening. You'll see consistent trends, whether you're looking at the Greg Elephant's study, whether you're looking at the old Snow and Marshall, whether you go and you talk to a bunch of cops who carried 40 and used it, talk to a bunch of cops that carried 9mm and used it, you'll come across these consistent trends. And the keyboard commando will tell you, oh, it's all fake, it's all about shot placement. Yeah, all the other sources of data are like, 40 does better, 40 does better, 40 does better. I'm a cop, 40 did better. I'm a cop, that 9mm kind of sucked when I needed to use it. You know, I don't think everybody's lying. I don't think all the data's lying. But for whatever reason, people just won't accept that the 40 Smith & Wesson is more effective, all because the FBI says, well, it's the most advanced cartridge now. It's better than everything else, blah, blah, blah. So I'll leave it at that. You guys can make up your own minds. For me, I'm sticking with the 40. So very interesting test. I did not think, honestly, that the 40 was going to go beyond like 8 or 9 inches. So I am surprised on that because that size of that hollow cavity. But looking at now, seeing how it was designed where it would break apart and more of that core would go deeper, now it makes sense. And honestly, kind of surprised me. I think both these rounds did okay, but overall, the 40 just is superior. Went through the arm bone and still expanded and did more damage. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like. And thanks for watching.